Thanks for joining us today for our Workday Chats. My name is Annette Melatti, and I'm your host for today's Workday Chats. If you have any questions, please feel free to share them in the comments below. So I'm going to start by setting the landscape for our discussion. So even before the COVID-19 pandemic, there were a variety of political, economic, social, environmental, and technological factors that were percolating, and actually what we like to call creating this perfect storm for disruption. Executives have been navigating uncertainty for a while now, and now with the increased pressure to make decisions more quickly. But how do you plan for the future with so many unknowns? How do you prioritize when so many external forces can reshape the business in a blink of an eye? How do you stay focused when the pace of change potentially requires the business to pivot with little or no warning? So we've been sharing a multi-part blog series that we've put into an ebook, and we thought we would host a conversation to highlight some of the key takeaways from that ebook. We brought together a panel to weigh in on the changing world of finance. I'm super excited to have with me today two very special guests. First, from the Hackett Group, Tom Willman, who's a Principal Finance Advisory Global Practice Leader. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you, Annette. Thank you for having me.
Glad you're with us. And from Workday, Tim Wakeford, who's a Vice President of Global Product Strategy. Welcome, Tim.
Hi, Annette.
And Tim is coming to us live from the UK, so it's a little bit later in the day for him. So appreciate you joining us.
No
So when we think about those macro forces impacting global organizations, I think we all agree that this disruption and uncertainty aren't likely to retreat anytime in the near future. And in order to be more resilient and even bounce back, businesses and the finance function specifically will need to fundamentally change how they operate. So Tim, I'd like to start our conversation with kind of a light topic around what's been top of mind lately for CFOs. As a former CFO, and now in your role at Workday, you spend a lot of time talking with CFOs. So what lessons learned have you heard CFOs speak about, and how are they using these lessons to fundamentally change how they're planning on operating?
Thanks, Annette. Nice, easy question to start with then. So, so you're right. I spend a lot of my time engaging with CFOs around the world, and I think there's probably two trends that I've picked up from these kind of conversations that I'm having with them most weeks. I think the first is that there's, no question that this period of disruption and uncertainty has put the spotlight on the need to become more resilient as a finance function in the face of change. And this means that CFOs need to preside over organizations that are more agile. It's incredibly difficult to be resilient if you lack agility. And we'll unpack specifically what we mean for that throughout the conversation. And I think the second trend that I see everywhere really is the need for finance leaders to strike a balance between focusing their time, their efforts, and their resources on the near term. So doing the things you'd expect a finance function to do during a crisis, such as preserving cash, increasing the focus on receivable collections, managing spend, optimizing supply relationships, etc. So balancing that short-term activity with their longer-term objectives and their vision for the wider business. And so they're really striking a balance between seeing the importance of keeping that focus and that control tight without losing an eye for the opportunities and the longer-term vision of the organization. So there are many things that are going on in the conversations I'm having, but really I'd condense it down to those two things: resilience, agility, and then on the other hand, that focus and the balance between near-term and slightly longer-term objectives. That's pretty much what I'm picking up.
Great. Thank you for setting the stage so perfectly. So Tom, a recent research report that you co-authored around the imperatives for CFOs post-COVID speaks directly to what CFOs are doing to embrace and successfully navigate change. So I'd love for you to share with our listeners what your research revealed.
Sure, Annette, thanks. And I think the first thing I would say is that I think this idea of a post-COVID world is still a moving target. Even with the positive news that's come out about the effectiveness of vaccines, our research is showing that companies are getting less optimistic as it relates to kind of when things are going to fully stabilize. But having said that, the research that you referenced really did highlight 5 things or imperatives that CFOs are or should be focused on. The first is around remote working. I think finance organizations and other support functions have demonstrated that they can work effectively in a remote environment. I do think the challenge now is how can we think creatively and use technology to make this more sustainable? So I think it's really time for CFOs to think about that future of work and what that's going to look like. Because I did want to share a stat with you. This is kind of hot off the press research that we asked finance organizations, what percent of your staff worked primarily at home 4 days a week or more before the crisis? And what's that going to look like after the crisis? And before the crisis, it was only around 2%. Finance leaders like to have their people in the office. But post-crisis, they're saying they expect that to be about 23%. So about a tenfold increase there, with a significant percentage also saying they'll work at least 1 day a week remotely. So a lot of work to be done there. Overhauling inflexible planning processes, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that in this session. Making cash king or keeping cash king. There's already been a lot of work done in organizations around cash and liquidity, but there's really no better security blanket in a time of uncertainty than cash. Continuing to optimize costs, and then I guess an imperative that really impacts all of the four that I've already talked about, and that's accelerating digital or technology initiatives.
In the Workday blog series that I talked about when we kicked off, we focus on 5 key areas for finance leaders to explore in order to guide their businesses through persistent change. It's not surprising how closely aligned and consistent our findings are with your findings as well. So we previously hosted a discussion on the importance of agility in finance. Was our last LinkedIn Live chat that we did around finance. So I'd love for us to unpack the findings that Tom just shared from the Hackett Group research and discuss why they're so important to creating more agility for an organization, as well as helping finance transform how they operate. So Tom, when we think of agility, an activity that quickly surfaced when I was doing some research for some of our messaging as one of the most important early in the pandemic was continuous what-if scenario modeling. You specifically talk about overhauling the inflexible planning process in your paper. So why is this so important to being agile?
Sure, and in fact, I think this, inflexible planning, I think was the number 2 cited barrier by companies to being able to respond to the crisis, behind only manual processes, the prevalence of manual processes. And, when I talk to my clients about what planning looks like in their organization, there are some common themes or words used to describe it, none of which align to agility at all, right? What we hear is it's very calendar driven, very scheduled. It's highly detailed, largely manual. Some use of drivers and assumptions, but not really pervasive throughout the process. And that leads to very long cycles that you would say by the time I'm done with it, it's kind of irrelevant and time to start again. But if we're to be more agile, finance organizations really need to establish that scenario modeling capability, ongoing scenario modeling capability, so we can very quickly see what impact are changes in our assumptions or changes in drivers going to have on our performance and the outcomes that we're trying to attain. And the only way that they're going to be able to do that is if they overhaul the infrastructure that they're using for planning. They need to be more event driven. They need to really challenge the level of detail and the degree of involvement in the planning process and who contributes to that. And of course, they're going to have to improve the technology that's enabling that process.
Yeah, Tom, just jump in there. I really agree with that. It's a word I actually recognize from my own kind of personal background, but it's definitely a conversation that we're picking up as we engage, with finance functions globally. That need to do better planning, that need to move away from kind of last year's up a bit, costs down a bit, gets to the number, and really start to get into those drivers. So finance are trying to position themselves as being able to answer the why question. And I think for many companies, that planning process isn't really doing that. And I think in addition to that continuous planning piece you just talked about, I think finance functions are in this environment, also very well placed to help business leaders forecast cash, and liquidity, and identify the risks associated with liquidity with greater speed and accuracy. I think many organizations have got, multiple sources of cash, obviously, but creating a complete picture of that overall cash position could be really quite challenging. If you don't have the right tools in place to do that, it can become, business critical if you're not careful. So totally echo what you were just saying, recognize it personally, definitely picking it up in the conversations that I'm having globally.
As you both were talking, a story comes to mind, or a conversation comes to mind that I had with our VP of FP&A here at Workday. And this was kind of early days in the pandemic, back in the March timeframe. And he said that, our goal was to move to continuous planning and move away from, Tom, as you talked about, the very scheduled, almost annual process. And he said that this pandemic actually has thrust us into the continuous mode, because you can't be modeling what your business could look like, and when things are changing literally by the hour, by the day. So it was just like he said that, that was our goal, was to get to that continuous planning. We would get there. He says we've now been thrust into it, and it's now had to make it happen. So I've another conversation or opportunity that I had was to listen in on a few of the CFO roundtables that were hosted by our CFO, Robin Cisco. And another lesson that many organizations are taking forward is around having continuous access to key insights. It was interesting listening to the CFOs go around the room on what lessons did they learn during this pandemic, and what those lessons were they going to move forward and take with them into the future. And this access to continuous insights was key. So Tim, what's your perspective on what this data should consist of? And how finance organizations are changing the way they make insights more accessible to the broader organization?
Yeah, really good question. I had a fantastic conversation with the CFO last week, actually, on this very topic. And what was really interesting was he said to me that, back in the beginning of this year, when the pandemic was really starting to hit, and really biting into his organization, he was telling me that he was being asked so many questions from the business about things he'd never considered before, things that his organization wasn't geared up to answering before. And what he said was really quite striking. He said, I just didn't even know where to get the answers from. The answers to the questions I was being asked did not exist in my company. And that was really quite striking as you start to think about this, because what I think should happen is, I think what it really shines a light on is the fact that businesses need to have access to all kinds of operations. So finance leaders need to have access not just to traditional financial ERP data, but they also need access to workforce data, operational data, and any other third-party data sources, but to bring those together as a single source of the truth to really start to answer some of those fundamental stakeholder questions. I think business leaders, outside the finance function, are increasingly looking to finance to provide deeper insights from a wider range of data sources to help them make better decisions. And in many organizations I talk to, they can do that. Many organizations have the ability to bring data sources, but where they really lack in capability is the ability to do that in a timely fashion, the ability to do that using real-time information, and the ability to deliver that to their organization in a secure and fashion, really trying to arm the business leaders with the information that they need to make better decisions. So even if they can do it, they find it challenging to have real value in it. But for many organizations, they're not even thinking about merging finance data, HR data, operational, or even third-party data sources. So I think really the goal for finance needs to be bringing those data sources together. Firstly, actually identifying which are the data sources that are most relevant, that impact financial performance, then bringing them together, and then being able to share those with the organization. But really critically for finance, taking data points and converting data into insights, and insights into recommendations. One thing we hear loud and clear, or I pick up loud and clear, is the business do not want finance to provide more data. The business wants finance to provide greater insight and recommendations. So I think it's about harnessing the data and really converting that into something that's strategically relevant for the organization. That's kind of the crux of where I think this particular issue is going.
Yeah, Tim, I think you highlighted some really important points there around the integration of internal and external data, looking beyond just financial data. And you're right, it's going to be important for finance to be able to answer questions that maybe they haven't been asked before. But I actually have a client I was just talking to, a CFO last week. She's creating an environment and a small team of folks with data science backgrounds that, they're not waiting for the question, right? They're doing exploration with all of that data that they've been able to pull into their data curation environment. So they'll be going to the business with, here's some really unique insights that maybe you haven't thought about before, and really raising their game in terms of the value that they're able to deliver. But I did want to share even a more basic example around the insight that I think finance really has an obligation to provide to their businesses. I think when times are good, the focus is always on top line and bottom line. And cash, while everybody acknowledges it's important, in good times, it can kind of lag in importance and doesn't get as much focus as maybe it should. But in an environment like we're in today, where cash is absolutely crucial, there's a lot of insight to be gained and shared when you look at things as basic as paying my bills and collecting my cash. So if finance can provide, good insight into, use some external data to provide insight into, the condition of my suppliers and my customers, and can meld that with some internal information from my receivables and payables, it can really help the business make wise decisions around, how and where should I be extending my payables so that I'm not impacting or jeopardizing relationships with strategic suppliers, or jeopardizing the survival of some of my smaller suppliers. Yeah. And the same holds true on the customer side. So lots of exciting things happening right now around the whole business insight topic.
And I think, and I completely agree. And I love something that our CFO said, that, yes, finance has always been critical to the finance function, to both accounting and finance practitioners, but it's also important to the rest of the business. And I think finance has a huge opportunity and responsibility to help get that insight out to, I like to say, all corners of the business, all ends of the business. So love the topic around insight. So Tim, if we go back to something that you said earlier around striking that balance between the near term, the more tactical actions, with the longer term, more strategic, we're hearing about investing in innovation, specifically around accelerating digital initiatives. And nowhere is this more important than when we think of the core accounting processes that reflect the backbone or the heart of most accounting and finance teams. So Tom, your research, I loved it because it aligns perfectly to this around accelerating your digital initiatives. It states that remote works. Can you share insight into what you found worked and what didn't?
Sure. So let's see, what worked well? And almost universally, when I talk to CFOs, controllers, they all say it has worked well. We're closing our books on time. We're meeting our reporting deadlines. It's working. Well, why is that? I think in large part is that we found our employees, have been able and willing to step up and do what needs to be done to get the job done, to complete our tasks. What I would say, what may not work in the future is if we continue to operate in the same way without addressing our underlying processes and the technology that we're using to enable those. Because I think we've all heard and started to, you hear things in the press about people getting burned out. We may have experienced that personally. At some point we're gonna, and some maybe already have, where you reach that tipping point where, the productivity spike that we saw right after the pandemic may start to wane. So there are absolutely some initiatives that companies are going to have to undertake if what we've been able to achieve so far is sustainable. And I'll start with automation. And for some, this might involve a complete replacement or upgrade of the core ERP. For others, it may be, I need to make sure that I'm fully leveraging what I have in my ERP. Or I may need to implement a solution to enable the dynamic or continuous planning processes that we just talked about. Complementing those core financial applications with smart automation, whether that's RPA, cognitive automation, machine learning, to kind of extend that functionality. Or going back to insight, implementing data management, data curation, and visualization capabilities to generate and distribute that insight. So that's kind of a long list. Every company kind of has to prioritize, what's most important to them and what's going to generate the most benefit for them. But, when I look at and listen to CFOs and heads of FP&A and controllers about their agendas, you're going to find a lot of those initiatives on there. And I would say the key is to really manage these as kind of an ecosystem or a portfolio of initiatives, and think about how do each of these technologies fit in our environment versus just point projects. Because I think when you get into just point projects, you tend to suboptimize what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, Tom, that completely aligns, unsurprisingly again with what I'm seeing. What's interesting is I think organizations went into shock back at the start of this year when the pandemic hit. That shock, forced organizations into a certain way of working. And I think typically, again, I'm having similar conversations to you, Tom, and finance functions are coping and have actually coped reasonably admirably in many, if not most cases. I think the difference would start to happen where that initial shock subsides and it starts to become business as usual. Because a lot of organizations put a lot of transformation initiatives on hold. They kind of contracted, they went into, let's keep the lights on mode. Let's do what we have to do. We'll worry about changing things next year. If this kind of pandemic continues, and obviously we heard great news over the last 24, 48 hours around a potential virus vaccine. But if this continues, then it starts to become genuinely the new way of working. And I think that'll be quite interesting to see how finance functions can keep up that enthusiasm for this remote working whilst doing their day job and taking on the extra strain of extra initiatives. But I think really the need for finance to embrace more efficient and dynamic ways of working isn't new, and it predates the pandemic. And again, just as you mentioned, Tom, I think what we're now seeing is that the pandemic is going to be an accelerant. It's going to start to drive the imperative for a finance organization's transformation. And I think that'll come from two ways. It'll come from the business wanting more from finance because of the way they've needed to manage the business over the last 10 months. But it will also come possibly more organically than has been that's happened in the past. It'll come through the finance function with them effectively saying, can't operate like this any longer. Yes, we could get by like that for a period of time, but for us to genuinely move in the direction that we want to go and the business wants us to go, we're going to need to do something different. And that different has to be embracing automation and those emerging technologies. There's just no other alternative, I think, to the function.
Right. And one of the things that I'm starting to see in a number of my clients is and they use different names, right? But one of the more common is they're creating innovation centers of excellence. Sometimes they reside in finance, maybe in IT, but it's really the job of that center of excellence to really, help identify, what technologies what technologies should we be taking advantage of that we aren't today? What are some of the use cases that are relevant for our organization, and then, helping the business prioritize what do we start with when. And I spoke with the head of one of these centers of excellence recently, and they started with their initial objectives were twofold. One, evaluate our ERP environment and evaluate the benefits and the possibilities of moving that to the cloud. The other component was around robotic process automation. But over time, as they've matured, they're implementing their ERP. They've got, a number of RPA automations in place and are starting to scale that. But now, they're looking at cognitive and machine learning. They're looking at advanced analytics and, data curation technology. So it's continued to expand and is really the source of a lot of the innovation that they're implementing from a technology perspective, but that's also changing the way fundamentally how they're doing work as well.
You know, I love, love, love seeing finance and accounting embracing new technology, because I think that for so many years, both the finance and accounting functions have really just, I think they've just assumed that this is the way things operate. You know, this is the way things are. This is what they've got. They have to work with what they have. And now to start seeing them embrace this, and that this, you know, there's, I like one of our our customers, CFOs from one of our customers said that they've never met a crisis that they didn't like. And I love the fact that they're looking at these disruptions or these crises or these times of uncertainty and embracing them head on and looking at them as opportunities versus kind of backing away from them and not taking advantage of that opportunity. So I love hearing that things are accelerating around embracing technology for the finance and accounting. Just in general, it's like go finance and accounting. So exciting. So let's pivot to when we look at how closely, I think nobody's going to argue that closely connected to investing in technologies and these emerging technologies to transform this finance function is also having the right mix of skills and roles to make that transition successful. So we've talked a little bit about, yes, I love how accounting and finance are making that happen. So, and we're hearing stats like that at least 50% of their workforce will be reskilled by 2024 to contend with this changing work. So Tom, with all the organizations you work with and benchmark, I would really love to hear your some of the inside scoop around the progress that accounting and finance teams are really making with upgrading their skills or their plans to ensure that they have the staff to really take advantage of technology to change how they operate.
Sure. So there's no doubt that with all of the change that we're talking about from a technology and a process perspective, that the changes in the skills that are required, it's a natural, it's a natural fit there. I think some of the more important or most important skill improvements that finance and accounting organizations are looking for are around technology and willingness and comfort in using and adapting to new technology, as well as comfort and ability in data analysis, data management. And I think finance has definitely invested in training for their existing employees on these and given them project opportunities so they get exposure to different types of technologies and how those can improve the work that they do. But I'm also seeing some changes on the talent acquisition front as well. So I'm seeing more finance organizations recruiting individuals with computer science backgrounds and business analytics backgrounds that, you just didn't see before. And not as a replacement for some of the core finance and accounting, skills that they have in place, but more to complement that. But I think equally as important, yes, data and technology is important, but equally as important are some of the softer skills. And I almost neglect to call them softer skills because I think, that can almost diminish their importance, but being able to tell the story behind numbers and analysis, executive presence, and ability to communicate with impact, negotiation, persuasion, ability to influence. When we talk about generating insight and the importance of that insight, you've got to have, finance professionals that can communicate that and put that into action effectively with the businesses that they support. And I'll say I had the pleasure to spend some time with one of my clients' group of summer interns this year. And it really blew me away how it became apparent how important companies feel like these softer skills are, because those interns were preparing for presentations to the CFO and, in some cases, the CEO or heads of business units. I know when I was an intern, they kept me as far away from those executives as possible. When now,
yes.
I mean, it's right at the forefront. You're doing that as an intern, you're doing that in your entry-level positions, And I think that just underscores how important those skills are.
Couldn't agree more. And I love and again, kind of going back to embracing the technology that they also see, they view this as an opportunity. Hopefully it sounds like some are seeing this as an opportunity, and not like it's something that it's a negative. Because I think that the more finance and accounting types that have an understanding of these technologies, know how to interpret insight and be more, they're strategic thinkers, they're going to actually be more valuable. Those are going to be skills that are going to, take them, I think, greater places in their careers. So,
Definitely.
So Tim, did you have anything to add?
No, I was just going to jump in on that. And obviously, that's a little bit of my background, having spent 25 years as a qualified accountant running and leading finance functions. The ability to communicate effectively, the ability to understand technology, the ability to take controlled and effective risks is a differentiator. So anyone listening to this that thinks that not communicating well or not understanding the trends in the market is a good thing, that's career limiting. So really grasp this. I love the point that Tom was making there. Really important.
So our last kind of topic is around talking about, inspiring a culture of trust and integrity. So our recent Conversations for a Changing World event that we had spoke to stakeholder capitalism. I think some folks also call it conscious capitalism, which I think is an absolutely fascinating topic. And if there's one thing that's been highlighted as a result of this pandemic is the emphasis on integrity and trust during times of uncertainty. Consumers, whether they're purchasing for themselves or for their organization, increasingly want to buy from companies that demonstrate integrity in how they treat their employees, their customers, the environment. So Tim, large businesses are being asked by stakeholders to stop merely promising, to put purpose over profit, and instead make trust an organic value. So can you kind of elaborate on that? I'd love to hear your perspective, because this is a really fascinating topic for me.
Yeah, it's actually something I find not that easy to get my head around initially. If you think about how finance leaders are, we've spent many years and decades in most cases of counting the numbers, telling the story, driving the organizations forward from a purely typically financial perspective. So to then be asked to pivot and start saying, okay, the numbers are great, but there's all of this other stuff that's non-financial, and we're actually going to bring that into our reporting regimes, whether it's through statutory obligations, whether it's through stakeholders or just other kind of management initiatives. So I think it's actually something that catches some finance people by surprise, because we're just not necessarily brought through on a guide path that's actually going to deal with it. But when you stop and you kind of get over the initial shock of what do you mean I have to talk about something that's not a number, once you get over that shock, it actually starts to really appeal to you from a professional and obviously an ethical perspective. At the end of the day, finance leaders are people, and we all want to do the right things, and we all think that we do act that way. So it's a bit of a culture shock, I think, for some finance people to have to do this, but it's definitely the direction of travel. So, we were talking just now around technology and trends and moving in that way. This is clearly one of those trains that we all need to get on board. But I think if people are trying to make trust an organic and a really ingrained value within their organization, first thing is there's a bit of, you should be a bit of inflection in terms of understanding, well, is trust not already there? What are we doing that hasn't been trustful? So I think there's a kind of introspection that needs to happen there. But fundamentally, to deliver that trust, I think, again, you do need the right tools to deliver transparency. And again, I think that does come back down to technology, but also to the processes that enable businesses to track, analyze data, and then deliver it to the wider business, to those key constituents, in order for them to be held accountable for their actions, because they now have the resources to make decisions. And for us as a finance function to be held accountable, because we are providing the business with the tools to do the job, which starts to generate trust. We deliver the right information, they have the right information to make decisions in many cases. So that's a large part of trust. And I think for businesses, it's also about making pretty bold internal changes and committing to operating differently in the way that Tom was just kind of talking about. It is about being open and transparent. Again, not all finance functions. Certainly, if I look back on my career, it wasn't always like that. Sometimes people didn't want to be challenged about the numbers. I think it's the complete opposite now. It's about pushing the numbers out there, pushing the story out there, and asking the business to be held accountable, not finance to be held accountable just for the numbers. And so we really have a part to play in this journey towards trust and transparency. It's about delivering real-time data from a variety of sources, delivering these insights to the rest of the organization, and driving collaboration, which will ultimately lead into better decision making. So there's a couple of things there. It's a bit of a culture shock. It's a bit of a deal with it personally, kind of, it's a bit like a form, form, storm, non-perform kind of approach. And but when you get through it, it's really quite interesting. But again, it's like everything. You need the data to make the right decisions for the business.
So Tom, I'm curious to see with the customers that you interact with, how much this is coming into play. And it might be very low. It might be, maybe a quarter of the customers that you work with, but curious to see just based on the customers that you interact with, your clients, what that looks like.
Yeah, I think I'm seeing it more than I did. I don't know that I've thought about, our percentage, but maybe a quarter or a third of
Yep.
organizations that I speak to bring this up, and they certainly acknowledge that it's important for finance to be able to support the information requirements needed for it. But I also hear, and it's not something that we've brought up yet, is it's going to become a differentiator, and really already is, from a talent acquisition and retention perspective. I think there's definitely a lot of value attributed to kind of the integrity, the trust, the culture that my company displays when I think about where I want to work and build my career.
I think it just, when we think about our lives in general, work, but then our personal lives, and whether it's someone that's working on our car, whether it's our accountant, whether it's, whoever it is, even you think about the medical professionals that we all are dealing with, and we gravitate towards people we trust. We gravitate towards people that we think have our best interest in mind. And so when you start creating a community like that, and I think then you look at, software providers and people looking for software solutions, I think it's also something that I think now. I had one of our customers say this once, that had been on mainframe solutions for a while, on-premise solutions for a while, and was moved to the cloud. And she just said the vendor plays such a different role in a cloud-based, in a SaaS world, than it did in an on-premise world. And she says, and it's in the dynamic, because now so much of the responsibility for that software is in the vendor's hands, not in the client's hands. And so I think that's where we see that elevated. So to summarize, this has been a wonderful conversation, but I think it'd be helpful to identify the practical steps that CFOs can take right now to set their organizations up to successfully navigate change, and to create that agility required to actually thrive as they move forward. So Tom, why don't you give us your thoughts on what practical steps you feel are top of mind?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, the CFO and his or her leadership team, they need to chart the course, highlight what those key priorities are, so the organization is focused on the right things, and we're all, driving towards the right outcomes. Investing and allocating resources to the right initiatives. And, I think, close behind that, I think making agility a priority. There's no doubt, I don't think you'd get any disagreement from finance or any other function that, that agility is going to be key to that future. Continuing to invest in insight capabilities and really defining what kind of the future of work is going to look like. Those are the things that I think are going to be paramount for finance organizations and companies to thrive into the future.
And Tim, what would you add?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with everything Tom just said. I think really it boils down to ensuring that the critical success factors are in place within that kind of finance function and the wider organization, and moving to develop them if they're lacking. I think I'd probably summarize 4 areas. The first, again, is what Tom just said, is agility. Then the fundamental requirement to build resilience and ensure that they can maintain effective leadership regardless of the macroeconomic conditions is paramount. I think balance is really important. Again, right at the start, you asked me what I was picking up, and it was that ability to focus efforts on the short term, but also not to lose sight of some of those longer term, commercial opportunities. I think balance is critical. Data we've spoken a lot about over the last half an hour or so. The ability or the fundamental requirement to understand the correlation between data sets, internal and external, on your financial performance, and then how you can convert that data or that insight into strategic recommendations is really, really, really important. And then the last piece we just discussed around transparency. So engender trust in the finance function. We are going to need to undertake new ways of working. We are going to need to look to service the needs of the stakeholders wherever they are, whatever they are, whenever they are. And that's going to slightly move a little bit of conflict, I think, in the short term with the finance function that wants to provide financial information in kind of month-end cycles, monthly, quarterly, and kind of annual cycles. So I think they're the things that are moving. And the common theme across all of these, well, it's no surprise, is technology. Without that right technology in place to support these initiatives, it's just going to be almost impossible to meet these seemingly conflicting requirements in an efficient manner. So they're probably the 4 areas I'd focus on, all underpinned by that technology platform.
Wonderful. This has been such an amazing conversation. I could probably chat with you guys for hours because I just love talking about technology and how the role of finance and accounting continues to evolve. So much to think about and to consider. Thank you both so very much for sharing your viewpoints with me and our audience today. I really appreciate your time. And until next time, join us again next month for our next episode of Workday Chats. Thanks so much and have a great workday.